Welcome back to Lockdown Universe, home of the bizarre, peculiar, and unheard of stories of UFO lore. And today I want to talk about David Adair. If you have not heard about David Adair, you should really do yourself a favor and take a look at his website and look him up on Google, and you'll find out a lot of information about him. But I'm going to start this story off and tell you about him and his history and give you a little bit of insight into what he's discovered. He is one of the only people to come out and state that they actually have seen an alien aircraft, touched an alien aircraft, gone inside an alien aircraft and inside its engine space, and been able to interact with it. As far as I know, he's the only person that's done that and come out and stated he's done that, and probably lived to tell about it. So let me give you a little bit of history about him. He's at age 11, David built his first rocket. This guy was a mastermind as far as scientifically goes, physics goes, mathematics goes, just a genius. His first rocket was a cryogenic liquid-fueled engine that was 6 feet tall, 200 pounds in weight, and had enough thrust to push it to an altitude of 52,000 feet at a speed of 1,600 miles an hour, with a radio-controlled guidance and parachute recovery. The rockets got bigger and faster from that point on. Today, there are only two types of rocket engines used by the space agencies around the world: liquid fuel and solid propellant. And at age 17, David built a rocket engine that was neither one. It was electromagnetic fusion containment engine and the first of its kind. It was launched on June 20th, 1971 from White Sands Missile Proving Grounds, for which he was later awarded the most outstanding in the field of engineering sciences from the United States Air Force. It was during this time that David was actually allowed to go into Area 51 and below Area 51, and this is where the story gets truly interesting. And I'm going to pull up some information from alienjigsaw.com, and it's a little interview between David and an interviewer where he discusses his interaction with some of the not too friendly military individuals, and I think they were a little bit intimidated by David's intelligence. And so we get into this story here a little bit. What they did was they brought David down to the proving grounds to shoot the rocket off in a safe manner. But at one point, they asked him to shoot it towards Groom Lake, and he got a little bit concerned because, well, he knew that there was a military base over there. And he said, well, why would you want me to shoot it over that way? And they kind of were gruff and rough with him and said, don't worry about it. Just get it over there, and we'll go and we'll retrieve it at that location. And so these guys started getting really rough with him at this point, and he was only 17 at the time. So after they shot off his rocket, and he mapped out the location and the trajectory to make sure it was going to hit the right location, they arrived in Nevada, and they flew to the landing site. And he looked down at these twin 10,000-foot runways and said, oh my God, there's a huge base down there. This was an area that he didn't realize had a base at it. He thought he was going to a different base. This was a new base. It wasn't located on any map, and it was just before the base on the map. So he had no idea he was actually going to Area 51, but he was going to Area 51. So after he got out of the plane, they put him on this go-kart looking thing, he states, and he said it kind of looked like one of those electric carts that you see at the airports, and they drove down to the landing strip to a series of hangars and headed into the center one. And he said it was really cool the way the place was built, because it was built on these humongous screw-like pipes, so that when it lowered the level that they were on, it could carry an enormous amount of weight. He goes on to state that when they got to the hangar, Yeah, he stated they were on giant worm screws. So in my mind, I'm thinking like standard screws, but just, you know, humongously large, like a 747, right? And he states that it's much more stable than a hydraulic system would have been. So he stated that they went very far down. He feels like they went, I think he said 20 stories down is what it felt like to him. And he stated that to get into the place, one of the officers got out and put his hand up to a scanner that flashed a light at him. And he thought it took his picture, but he stated in hindsight he would have guessed it would have been a retina scanning device. So he stated this is in 1971. And to give us some perspective on 1971, David stated that there was no laptops in 1971, no modems, no faxes, no VCR, no cell phones. And he states they didn't even have handheld calculators at that time. Texas Instruments developed those about 5 years later. So it really gives you an idea and a perspective of what's going on here. This technology is far, 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 far more advanced than 1971, obviously. I mean, how many businesses have even that technology? They have thumbprint scanning technology now, and that's only been in the past 20 years, maybe since 2000. So, very few places are using that. So it's kind of interesting. So he states that they went into a room where he noticed an immediate temperature drop because obviously it was warm upstairs and outside in Nevada. And he stated it was very cool down in this room, almost like you could see your breath. And when he entered the room, the lights had no shadow being cast anywhere. So the light was so good that it seemed to be emanating from almost everywhere. No shadows. It's kind of interesting, bizarre. What kind of lighting system could have done that? Then he stated that someone threw a switch and activated a hoist that pulled up some cables that were attached to a large tarp. So imagine a humongous tarp being pulled up by a hoist and lifted straight up. And what he saw was a giant electromagnetic fusion containment engine, very similar to the one he had made. And he was, again, remember, he's only 17, right? So he was fascinated because this thing was the size of a Greyhound bus, and we all know how big those things are. They're larger than most buses that we use standardly. I mean, they're bigger than even school buses. And he stated that this thing was as big as one of those buses. His containment engine that was similar to this was only the size of a watermelon, right? So his immediate thought was, my God, what size of vehicle would a Greyhound bus engine fit into and propel? So he stated that he could recognize that the engines were comparable, but he likened it to looking at a Model A Ford and then looking at a Lamborghini engine or a Viper engine today. And he said you'd recognize that they're both internal combustion engines, but the difference between the two was just unbelievable. So once he saw the engine, some of the officers in the midst of this group started stating, "Hey, son, we want you to give us a hand with this. You want to help your country, don't you?" And of course, every kid was a flag-waving American patriot, and he wanted to give them a hand. And so David stated, "Well, sure, that's no problem, but where are the people that built this engine?" He's thinking, shouldn't they be here working on this right now? Somebody maybe with a little bit more training. And they stated, "Well, they're on vacation right now, and you're off on summer vacation, right?" And they said, "Well, hey, why don't you give us a hand?" And so David asks, "Well, did they leave any notes on this work? Anything I can look at?" And they said, "Well, they took them with them as homework." And they said, "You know what homework is, don't you?" And kind of being condescending to David, being that he was only 17. And David knew they were kind of being condescending, but he stated, "Okay, I'll play along with this a-hole." And he was a little bit more graphic than that. But that's what he stated. That was his exact quote. I try to keep it PG, but I took a few letters out there for you. So he agreed to help them and take a look at a little bit closer at the engine, and seeing that there were no shadows anywhere, he was still very perplexed and still had many questions. But when he looked at this engine, it resembled a figure eight. And so you can imagine two circles that have the crosshairs that meet in the middle. And what he stated was the middle was the eye of the hurricane. And that middle was where the damage occurred. And so he knew his own engine, and he knew exactly what was going on, and he assumed that this engine had the same kind of problem, and this was a breach in the electromagnetic flux field that acts as the containment wall and harnesses the power of the engine. So he went on to state that these engines are like a magnetic bottle, and it's impossible to figure out how another engine like this works unless you have a lot of time to work on it. But he does know, and he stated that black holes work very much in the same way. They can suck an entire galaxy full of suns into a single point of singularity. And obviously a black hole has no problem containing that amount of fusion of energy. So the containment was the problem and seemed to be the point of damage here. Although the containment of the energy was not the problem, it looked like this engine had some damage from maybe some sort of ballistic missile or some sort of explosive warhead missile. He stated that the engine looked really cool to him at 17, obviously, right? There wasn't a single screw or a rivet or a weld seam anywhere on the entire device from front to end, right? So this thing was developed and created by a very highly technologically advanced civilization. It looked like it was grown rather than assembled, he stated. And he thought to himself, man, whoever built this really has some incredible manufacturing techniques. And he thought about over the years, we have the space shuttle missions and all these other fuel-propelled missions, and he thought, geez, well, why are we using these? Why we have this engine sitting down here. Why aren't we using this kind of an engine? He thought to himself, and this was 1971. So he went ahead and took a little bit closer of a look, and as he got close to the ship, or I shouldn't say the ship, the engine, he touched it, and he noticed that it was warm, which didn't make any sense at all because it was so cold in the hangar you could almost see your breath. He stated that he looked on the floor, he saw no power lines, and he asked himself, how in the world could this alloy be staying warm, right? It was really hard, so it shouldn't be warm. He stated that it was the hardest material he had ever touched. It didn't have any give anywhere, and that the surface cohesion tension on it felt more like a baby's skin. It was supple, but hard and warm. So, kind of very interesting, right? Almost organic in a way. And he said, well, this is weird, especially for metal. So he continued to look a little bit more deeply into it, and as he was crawling up onto the surface, he noticed that the Air Force guys' mouths were hanging wide open. And he's like, well, what's going on there? And why are they so freaked out? And he looked down to see that where he had his hand, it started to oscillate on the engine's surface, blue and white swirls moving through the hull, like wavelengths on an oscilloscope, right? And when he pulled his hands off, it stopped. And he thought, wow, this is really cool, right? This thing is interacting with me. This is really neat. And as he continued to climb up to the center area, he noticed that there were vertebrae that had branched off, cascading with fiber-like materials, almost like fiber optic cables that were filled with a fluid. If you think about that, fiber optic cables filled with fluid, what would they be doing? What kind of fluid would be going through there, and what would the purpose be? That's very interesting to think about. He said that the cables were like very small tubes of the size of angel hair pasta. And there were millions of these things cascading all over the hull of the engine, and he thought to himself, boy, these patterns look kind of familiar. He said, and then it dawned on him that they looked like neural synaptic firing patterns. And there were millions of them going everywhere, all over this thing. And so he thought to himself, well, maybe this engine was designed as an exoskeletal brain. And at that point, he stated that he reached out and grabbed some of the fibers and found out that they were really tough, actually, and that there were fluid inside of them. Wherever he touched, no matter what he touched, there would always be a reaction, like a tremor of visual lights. So this thing was really interacting with him on a biological and maybe even psychological scale. And as he walked down, he noticed the damaged area, and he got down into the damaged area, and he said to the Air Force guys, this thing's kind of like a power plant, right? It's more than a propulsion system. It's a power plant. And it's obvious that it came out of a big vehicle, a craft of some kind. So where's this thing, right? Where's the craft located? He stated that where's this craft, guys? I mean, had to have a crew. What'd you do with those people? It's clearly not American or Soviet technology, right, boys? So this has got to be some kind of extraterrestrial entity. How old is it? Did you guys dig it up? Is it millions of years old? Did you guys shoot it down? And I mean, the 17-year-old kid has tons of questions. And when he started asking those questions, those officers started to get really ticked off. And they told the MPs, the military police, to pull him down off the engine. And as he was coming down, David himself was really pissed off. And as he noticed, when he put his hands on the engine, now instead of that blue and white swirl, he started to notice what? That it started to become red and orange and flame-like. And he said, "Whoa!" And of course, again, right? Those military boys started having their mouths draped wide open again. And they're like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" So they took their hands off, and they noticed that this thing was reading his emotions. It was reading his psychological emotions through the surface of the engine. So when he got down, he asked the military officers if he could go into the damaged area as opposed to on top of the engine and take a look. And they said, yeah, make it brief. So when he got in, he looked in and saw some incredible looking technology up and down the engine walls on the inside. And he couldn't get more than 3 feet into it before he came up to a wall. And the wall was like an iris or a shutter on a camera lens. You know how they have all those fans that open up and close and contract, and they interlocked. And he said, wow, this would make the coolest door back home. And when he put his hand on the fan door, it just opened right then and there. It made a very slight noise, and he entered. And he said maybe that's the inspiration for the door design he saw at Area 51. He wasn't quite sure. But once he got in, he stated that everything was very small. Some parts, he had to machine with a microscope on his containment engine. Once he got into this area, everything was macro-sized, right? Big enough to walk through. He said he remembered that he had to manufacture certain functioning on the engine. It had to be somewhere else. It had to be developed somewhere else, just by the way it looked. There were crystals that were facing each other, and these were fabulous-looking crystals. He stated that they were integrated into a plasma duct-type device. And he didn't go into any more detail about that, but that's a very interesting portion of the story. In his engine, he had a hard time trying to lock down some of the cyclotron and blast waves, the propulsion of his device. And when he looked at this engine, it looked like a living machine. It looked both organic and inorganic at the same time. He said it felt like an oxymoron. He said he couldn't explain it. So when he got inside, he kind of used his photographic memory and kind of opened and closed his eyes like a shutter lens, just like the door, just to get a look and glimpse for what was going on the inside. And he felt like there was a presence on the inside, like an entity was inside with him, and that it knew he was there. That's what he felt like. He felt like it knew it was there, or that he was there. And as he exited, he put his hand back onto the engine, and it swirled white and blue because he had calmed down and it was more tranquil of a pattern, and left. And he stated that that's when he noticed that it was not just heat sensitive, but it was reacting to his mental waves. He felt that it was symbiotic and that the engine would lock on to how he felt. And he stated that he felt it would allow the engine to interface with him, and meaning that it was aware. Obviously, this thing was, just tons of years more advanced than anything that we have. But they escorted him out, and that ends the interview. I don't know as if he worked on it any more than that. I did want to get a little bit more in depth, and I might do a part 2 to this, see if I can rumble up some more information about what happened after this story. But I wanted to get this information out because I thought it was the most interesting part of the story, to describe the engine, just the engine, not even the ship, but just the engine, and how it interfaced with him and interacted with him, and how it had the angel hair pasta type fiber optics dripping all over it, and how it was very similar to his engine, but just on a macro scale, and had a few more pieces of the puzzle, some of the crystals and things like that. It's kind of interesting. If you watch Stargate, they have crystals in their ship, and the crystals power some of the ship. And you have to wonder if they didn't, some of the writers just didn't happen to read David's story and just kind of put it in there. But crystals seem to have some sort of power to them. I mean, if you go back through history and you read some of the mystics and witches and of the occult, crystals seem to have some sort of power to them. What kind of power that is, we're not 100% sure, but they seem to have some sort of power to them, that are able to power a massive ship apparently as well, or at least aid in doing so. So what are your thoughts? What do you feel? Do you feel is this a true story? Do you feel that David just made this all up? If you watch his interviews, you see, to me it seems as though he's telling the truth. It's up to you to decide what you feel is the truth. But until next time, take care of yourself. Interact with us on Lockdown Universe at Facebook, and on Instagram. We're going to start up a YouTube channel as well. You can email us at lockdownuniverse.com. If you'd like to tell a story, maybe we can do, an interview type story where you tell your interactions with the UFO universe. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Bye-bye.